10:25. There's something that happens when you walk alone that no one really talks about. Not the calories burned, not the steps counted. Something older than that. Something that happens below the level of thought, in the part of you that doesn't have words for what it needs. You've probably felt it. You go out for a walk. No destination, no podcast, no plan. And somewhere around the 10 or 15-minute mark, something shifts. The mental noise that felt permanent starts to thin. A thought you've been circling for days suddenly resolves into something clear. You feel, without being able to explain why, slightly more like yourself. Most people chalk this up to fresh air, or a change of scenery, or just the simple relief of stepping away from a screen. And those things matter, but they're not the real explanation. The real explanation goes much deeper, and it starts not in your lungs or your legs, but in the architecture of a nervous system that was never designed for stillness. Here's the thing almost nobody tells you about the human brain. It was built to move. Not as a metaphor, literally, structurally, neurologically built to move through space as its primary mode of operating. Sitting still, the posture in which most modern humans now spend the majority of their waking lives, is, from your brain's evolutionary perspective, a kind of emergency, a pause state, something that was only supposed to happen briefly, in moments of rest or concealment. The brain you carry inside your skull spent over 2 million years being calibrated almost exclusively during locomotion. Walking wasn't something your ancestors did between activities. Walking was the activity. Everything else, thinking, planning, socializing, problem-solving, happened while moving. And when you stop moving for most of the day, as almost all of us now do, something in the deeper circuitry of the brain starts waiting for a signal that never comes. That signal is bipedal locomotion, the rhythmic, alternating movement of walking. And what it does to the brain when it finally arrives is nothing short of remarkable. If you find this kind of exploration meaningful, the kind that explains what you feel before you can name it, consider subscribing and leaving a like. It helps this channel reach people who are asking the same quiet questions you are. To understand why walking affects the mind so profoundly, you have to understand something about how the brain processes time, threat, and thought. These three things are more connected than they appear, and locomotion sits at the intersection of all of them. Start with threat. The human nervous system is, at its core, a threat detection system. Everything else it does, creativity, memory, social bonding, abstract thinking, is built on top of that foundation. And the default state of a nervous system that is not receiving certain key inputs is a mild but persistent state of alertness. Not panic, not fear, just a low-level hum of readiness, a background vigilance that the body maintains when it doesn't have enough information to know whether it's safe. For your ancestors, that baseline vigilance was essential. A still body in a quiet environment was often a body in danger, hiding, waiting, conserving energy before action. The signals that told the nervous system it was genuinely safe were specific. Social connection was one, physical shelter was another. But one of the most powerful safety signals the body could receive was sustained, rhythmic movement across open terrain. Think about what that movement meant evolutionarily. If you were walking, not sprinting, not frozen, but walking steadily, it meant several things simultaneously. It meant you weren't being chased. It meant you weren't injured. It meant the environment around you was stable enough to move through. It meant you had a direction, a purpose, a destination in mind, even if only a vague one. Walking, in the ancestral world, was essentially the body's way of broadcasting to itself. Things are okay enough to keep moving. And the brain responded to that signal in a very specific way. It down-regulated the threat detection systems and up-regulated the networks responsible for exploration, creativity, and what neuroscientists call prospective thinking, the ability to mentally simulate the future and consider possibilities. In other words, walking didn't just calm the body, it changed which part of the brain was in charge. This is the mechanism that most people miss when they talk about walking and mental clarity. They assume the clarity comes from relaxation, from the mind going blank. But that's not quite what happens. What happens is closer to a shift in cognitive mode, from reactive, threat-focused processing to generative, exploratory processing. The brain doesn't empty, it opens. There's a network in the brain that neuroscientists call the default mode network. For a long time, researchers assumed it was just the brain idling, background noise that happened when nothing important was going on. But over the past 2 decades, imaging studies have revealed something surprising. The default mode network is not idle at all. It's one of the most metabolically active systems in the brain, and it's responsible for some of the most sophisticated things the human mind does: self-reflection, future simulation, narrative construction, creative association, and the ability to understand other people's inner lives. The default mode network activates most powerfully when the brain is released from immediate task demands. When there is no urgent problem to solve, no threat to assess, no incoming information requiring a response. And one of the most reliable triggers for this release is rhythmic walking at a comfortable pace. Here's why that matters. Most of us spend our days in a state of continuous partial attention. Screens, notifications, conversations, obligations. The modern environment is a relentless stream of things that require just enough cognitive engagement to prevent the default mode network from ever fully activating. We are, in the language of evolutionary biology, perpetually in the detection phase and never in the integration phase. Walking, particularly walking without audio input, without a destination that demands navigation, without a companion requiring social processing, creates what might be the only reliable window most modern humans have for their default mode network to do its actual work. And the work it does during those windows is not trivial. Studies examining creative problem-solving and walking have found that not only does walking increase divergent thinking, the ability to generate multiple possible solutions, but that the effect persists after walking ends. The brain's generative mode continues running for a period even after you sit back down. The window opened during locomotion doesn't snap shut the moment you stop moving. Now, there's a dimension to this that goes beyond cognition into something more primal and harder to measure. Something that has to do with the relationship between your body's movement and its sense of its own existence in time. I want to pause here and ask you something genuinely. When was the last time you walked somewhere with no destination and no audio in your ears? Not as exercise, not to clear your head as a productivity strategy, just walked. Think about that for a moment. Drop the answer in the comments, whether it was yesterday or whether you genuinely can't remember. I'm curious whether people who watch this channel are still doing that, or whether that particular human behavior has quietly disappeared from daily life. One of the stranger findings in the neuroscience of walking has to do with memory. Not just how walking affects memory consolidation, though it does significantly, but how walking affects the subjective experience of time itself. When you are sitting still, engaged with a screen or a task, time tends to compress. Hours pass without any internal sense of their passage. But when you walk without distraction through an environment that changes, even subtly, even just a city block or a stretch of park, your brain is constantly doing something it rarely gets to do in modern life. It's encoding spatial memory. Every step you take lays down what neuroscientists call an episodic trace, a small packet of experience anchored to a location. The tree you passed at the corner, the quality of light through a gap in the buildings, the smell of something cooking. These aren't conscious observations. You may not remember any of them explicitly, but they are being logged by a brain that evolved to navigate physical space and maintain a continuous map of where the body has been. The result of this encoding is a subjective experience of time that feels fuller, more textured, more inhabited. An hour of walking through a physical environment often feels longer, in a good way, in the way that a rich experience feels long, than an hour spent at a desk, which can feel both endless and empty simultaneously. This is not incidental. It's a direct consequence of the brain doing the kind of temporal and spatial work it was designed to do. The human mind was never built to process time abstractly, through clocks and schedules. It was built to measure time through space, through the changing of terrain, the position of the sun, the fatigue accumulating in the legs. When you walk, you give time back a shape. And the psychological effect of that is something almost everyone has felt, but almost no one has named correctly. The philosopher Frederick Groh wrote that walking is not a method of getting somewhere, but a state of being, something closer to a way of existing in the world. He wasn't being poetic for the sake of it. He was describing, in philosophical language, something that the body already knows in biological language. Walking is not transportation. It is, for the human nervous system, a mode of self-organization. Let's go a level deeper, into something that connects your feet to your mood in a way that feels almost improbable until you understand the anatomy. The foot is one of the most densely innervated surfaces on the human body. The sole alone contains thousands of sensory receptors, mechanoreceptors, proprioceptors, pressure-sensitive nerve endings, that send a continuous stream of information upward through the nervous system. This information doesn't just tell the brain where the foot is. It contributes to a broader neural signal that, in a very literal sense, helps the brain assess where the body is in relation to the world. When you walk barefoot, or even in thin-soled shoes on varied terrain, this system is richly activated. The brain receives a high-resolution sensory map of the ground beneath you: soft, hard, uneven, yielding, resistant. Each variation requires micro-adjustments from hundreds of small muscles, constant recalibration from the cerebellum, ongoing negotiation between balance and momentum. When you walk on a flat, smooth, uniform surface, a sidewalk, a treadmill, this sensory richness drops dramatically. The foot is doing far less. The proprioceptive input is simpler, less varied, less demanding. And the brain, which was calibrated to process the full complexity of natural terrain, receives a quieter, shallower signal. Researchers studying this difference have found that walking on natural, varied terrain produces measurably different neurological effects than walking on uniform surfaces. The difference shows up in stress hormone levels, in attentional state, in mood. Not because nature is inherently magical, though there are separate mechanisms at work there as well, but because varied terrain is the environment the brain's sensory systems were tuned to process. Your feet, in other words, are still looking for the ground they evolved to walk on. And when they find even a rough approximation of it, a gravel path, an uneven park lawn, the roots and dips of a trail, something in the nervous system registers a kind of recognition, a signal that the body understands before the mind does. There is a concept in evolutionary psychology called substrate matching, the idea that organisms function better when their environment matches the conditions under which their nervous system was calibrated. For the human foot, the ancestral substrate was complex, varied, unpredictable ground. For the human eye, it was natural light and depth of field. For the human ear, it was a soundscape of natural frequencies. And for the human body as a whole, it was sustained, moderate, daily locomotion across changing terrain. Modern life provides almost none of these things by default. The environment most of us move through every day, flat, climate-controlled, softly lit, acoustically dampened, is the single greatest mismatch in the history of our species. Not because it's unpleasant, it's often very comfortable, but comfort and calibration are not the same thing. And walking, especially walking outside, especially on terrain with some variation, especially without the acoustic intrusion of earbuds, is one of the few low-effort ways most modern humans can move back, at least partially, towards substrate matching. It doesn't require equipment. It doesn't require training. It requires only that you do the thing your body has been designed to do for 2 million years, which is to move through the world on your own 2 feet, paying attention to what's around you. There's another piece of this that rarely gets mentioned, and it has to do with what walking does to the relationship between the 2 hemispheres of the brain. Bipedal locomotion is a cross-lateral movement. As you walk, your left arm swings forward as your right leg steps, and vice versa. This isn't just biomechanics. It's a rhythmic, alternating activation of the left and right motor cortices, a bilateral brain pattern that is, in neuroscientific terms, unusual. Most activities either engage one hemisphere more than the other, or engage both in a relatively synchronous way. Walking's cross-lateral rhythm creates a specific kind of alternating bilateral stimulation. Researchers in trauma therapy noticed something interesting about this. A therapeutic approach called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, uses guided bilateral stimulation, typically in the form of controlled eye movements, to help the brain process distressing memories. The mechanism is not fully understood, but the effect is well documented. Bilateral stimulation seems to reduce the emotional charge of difficult memories while making them more accessible to conscious processing. Walking produces this bilateral stimulation naturally, not at the same intensity as clinical EMDR, but continuously, rhythmically, for the entire duration of the walk. This may be one of the reasons walking is so reliably effective at processing difficult emotions, not by suppressing them, but by creating a neurological state in which they become more workable, less stuck, less charged. Many people have noticed this without knowing the mechanism. You go for a walk carrying a problem, and somewhere in the middle of the walk, the problem hasn't disappeared, but it feels different, more like something you can move through rather than something that is holding you in place. The relief you feel is not imaginary, and it's not simply distraction. It's your brain doing in motion what it was designed to do. Integrate experience through the alternating rhythm of locomotion. There's something quietly devastating about this, if you think about it from the other direction. If walking is what the brain uses to process experience, to integrate memory, to regulate emotion, to enter its most generative cognitive mode, then what happens to a mind that rarely walks? What accumulates in a nervous system that never quite enters that state? There's no clinical answer to that question. The research doesn't frame it that way, but experience does. The particular kind of mental congestion that modern people describe, the feeling of carrying too many open loops, too many unresolved thoughts, a constant low-level pressure that has no clear source, might partly be the signature of a brain that is chronically underwalked. Not stressed exactly, not depressed exactly, just full. Full in a way that movement was always supposed to address and that nothing else quite replicates. If you're still here and this way of thinking about the body and the brain resonates with you, it would mean a lot if you subscribed and hit the like button. This channel exists because these questions deserve more than surface-level answers, and every person who engages makes it possible to keep going deeper. Let's talk about solitude, because it's inseparable from what walking alone does that walking with company doesn't. Social walking is not the same experience as solitary walking. Both are valuable. Both have real neurological effects, but they activate different systems, and the effects they produce are genuinely different. When you walk with another person, a significant portion of your cognitive and attentional resources are allocated to the social dimension, monitoring the other person's mood, calibrating your speech, managing the reciprocity of conversation. These are not trivial processes. They engage some of the most metabolically expensive systems in the human brain. When you walk alone, those systems are released, and the brain, freed from social processing, moves into a different mode, one that is less outward and more inward, less reactive and more reflective. The psychologist Esther Buchholz, who spent decades studying what she called the need for alone time, argued that solitude was not the absence of connection, but a distinct biological need, as fundamental to the organism as sleep and as systematically neglected by modern life. We have designed an existence in which almost every waking moment is socially saturated. Alone time, by which Buchholz meant not just physical separation from others, but genuine disengagement from social processing, has become almost architecturally impossible in most people's daily lives. Walking alone is one of the few contexts in which the social brain can genuinely rest. The street doesn't ask anything of you. The park path makes no demands. No one is waiting for your response. And in that space of release, something that is not quite thought and not quite feeling begins to move. Call it reflection. Call it processing. Call it the mind finding its own shape when it isn't being pressed into the shape that other people need it to take. There's a long history of solitary walking as a cognitive practice, not as exercise, not as leisure, but as a method of thinking. Darwin himself walked every day on what he called his thinking path at his home in Kent. He didn't walk to rest from thinking, he walked to think. He reported that he could not work through a difficult scientific problem without locomotion. His walking path was not separate from his work. It was part of the instrument he used to do the work. The philosopher Nietzsche was similarly emphatic. He wrote that truly great thoughts were conceived while walking. Rousseau wrote his most important work while walking. Wordsworth composed his poetry by walking and dictating aloud. Kant took a solitary walk at exactly the same time every afternoon, a routine so invariant that his neighbors reportedly set their clocks by it. These aren't coincidences. and they're not romantic eccentricities of the pre-industrial intellectual. They're evidence that people who depended on the quality of their thinking before there were nootropics or productivity systems or focus apps had independently discovered the same thing, that a moving body is a better thinking instrument than a still one. The reason we now understand is partly what we've already discussed: the default mode network, the reduction in threat response baseline, the bilateral brain activation. But there is one more mechanism that deserves its own space, because it operates at a chemical level, and its effects are often mistaken for something else entirely. Walking moderately for a sustained period, somewhere between 20 minutes and an hour at a comfortable pace, triggers a measurable increase in brain-derived neurotrophic factor, commonly called BDNF. BDNF is sometimes described in popular science as fertilizer for the brain, which is imprecise but not entirely wrong. More accurately, it's a protein that promotes the growth and maintenance of neurons, facilitates the formation of new synaptic connections, and appears to play a central role in the process by which experience is converted into long-term memory. BDNF levels are chronically low in people who are sedentary. They are elevated by cardiovascular exercise, including walking. And the effects of elevated BDNF are not subtle. They show up in measurable improvements in memory consolidation, in enhanced learning speed, in reduced symptoms of depression and anxiety that in some studies rival the effects of pharmaceutical intervention. This is a staggering fact, and it tends to get buried under the general umbrella of exercise being good for you, which is true, but which misses something specific. It isn't just that physical activity improves cognitive function in some general, catch-all way. It's that the human brain appears to require locomotion in order to maintain its own biological infrastructure. The neurons in your hippocampus, the structure most responsible for memory formation and spatial navigation, are, in a literal biochemical sense, dependent on you moving your body regularly to stay healthy. A brain that sits still is not merely idle. It is, slowly, degenerating the very structures that make rich thought and memory possible. And a brain that moves, even just walks, even just for 30 minutes a day, is actively investing in its own maintenance. The walk is not separate from the thinking. In a very real sense, the walk is what makes the thinking possible at all. This is the thing the title of this video is pointing at. Not that walking is good for you in the vague, well-meaning way that everything healthy is good for you, but that there is something specific, something irreplaceable that walking does to the mind. Something that sitting, regardless of how mindfully or productively you sit, simply cannot replicate. Sitting cannot produce the bilateral brain activation of locomotion. Sitting cannot provide the proprioceptive richness of moving through varied terrain. Sitting cannot trigger the default mode network's deepest activation. Sitting cannot generate the BDNF release that maintains the brain's own cellular architecture. Sitting cannot provide the temporal texture that comes from encoding episodic memories across physical space. And sitting cannot give the nervous system the ancestral safety signal that comes from sustained, unhurried forward movement through the world. These are not minor differences. They are, collectively, the difference between a brain that is running on its full operating system and a brain that is perpetually waiting for inputs that never come. And this is where the modern predicament becomes worth sitting with, or, perhaps more appropriately, walking with. We have built a world of extraordinary comfort and extraordinary capability, and in doing so, we have systematically removed almost every input that the human nervous system was calibrated over millions of years to receive. We sit on chairs designed for maximum lumbar support, while our bodies evolved to squat, to kneel, to sit on uneven ground. We sleep in temperature-controlled rooms while our circadian rhythms evolve to track the gradual cooling of night air. We eat at regular scheduled intervals while our metabolisms evolve to function on irregular feast and fast cycles. And we move, on average, less than at almost any point in human history, while carrying brains whose most fundamental operating requirements depend on daily locomotion. None of this is catastrophic in the way that dramatic events are catastrophic. It doesn't announce itself. It just accumulates, quietly, in the texture of how things feel. The low-level dissatisfaction that is somehow present even when everything is technically fine. The sense that clarity is always slightly out of reach. the feeling of carrying more than you can quite put down. These experiences are real, and they are not simply personal failures or signs of weakness. They are, in part, the predictable signature of a system running on a fraction of its required inputs. Walking alone, in silence, without destination, is not a cure for that. Let's be clear about what it is and isn't. It's not a therapy. It's not a spiritual practice in the formal sense. It's not a substitute for professional support when professional support is genuinely needed. But it is something. It is the single most accessible form of biological calibration available to almost any human being in almost any circumstance. It costs nothing. It requires no equipment. It demands no skill. And it provides, in a 30-minute window, a convergence of neurological inputs: bilateral stimulation, BDNF release, default mode activation, proprioceptive engagement, threat system downregulation, temporal texture, and episodic memory formation that no technology, no supplement, and no productivity system has yet found a way to replicate. There is a particular quality of attention that emerges during a long, solitary walk that is almost impossible to achieve any other way. Not focused attention, in the sense of concentration directed at a specific object. Something more diffuse, more receptive. A state in which the mind is moving but not striving, observing but not analyzing, present but not tense. Some contemplative traditions have given this state elaborate names and developed complex practices to cultivate it. But for the human animal, it was never meant to be rare. It was meant to be ordinary. It was the state the brain spent most of its waking life in, for most of human history, as the body moved across the terrain it was designed to move across. We have not lost the capacity for that state. It's still there, available, inside the same nervous system that evolved to inhabit it. We've just stopped providing the conditions under which it naturally arises. And those conditions, it turns out, are simpler than almost anything we've tried to replace them with. Go outside. Walk. Not to somewhere, just walk. Leave the earbuds. Let the thoughts come and go without managing them. Notice the ground under your feet, the quality of the light, the way the air feels different 10 minutes in than it did at the beginning. Let your arms swing. Let your pace find itself. You won't be exercising. You won't be meditating exactly. You won't be doing anything that modern productivity frameworks would recognize as useful. But you will be, in the deepest biological sense, doing exactly what you were built to do. And something in the part of you that has been waiting quietly for that input, for a very long time now, in a world that never quite provides it, will notice. That noticing is not mystical. It is by now thoroughly explainable. But the fact that it is explainable does not make it less real. If anything, knowing why it happens makes the decision to actually do it more compelling, not less. You are not taking a walk. You are restoring a signal, and the brain that receives that signal will, without any instruction from you, begin to do what it has always known how to do.